In August 1945, a woman stood in an Albuquerque train station holding a box of tissues that could change the balance of power on Earth. Beneath the paper tissues were sketches and documents from Los Alamos, details of the implosion bomb the United States had just revealed to the world over Japan. Security officers were searching passengers. If they opened the box, Lona Cohen would disappear into a federal prison, and one of the Soviet Union's most valuable atomic sources would be exposed. Instead, she began searching frantically for a ticket she claimed to have lost and handed the box to one of the men checking her luggage. The officer held the evidence in his own hands, then returned it and waved her toward the train. Years later, she and her husband would vanish from America, reappear in a quiet London suburb under new names, and build a second espionage machine beneath their kitchen floor. The couple did not look like professional spies. Morris Cohen had grown up in New York, excelled as an athlete, and studied at college during the upheaval of the Great Depression. But politics consumed him. In 1937, he crossed the Atlantic to fight with the Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. He was wounded, returned to the United States in 1938, and entered Soviet intelligence. To Morris, communism was not merely a party platform. It was a cause that claimed to stand against fascism, economic collapse, and the inequalities he believed Western governments had failed to solve. That conviction would allow him to redefine treason as service to a larger future. Lona was no passive partner. Born Leontine Teresa Petka in Massachusetts, she had left home as a teenager, moved to New York, and become active in left-wing politics. She married Morris in 1941. Soon afterward, he brought her into the clandestine world he already inhabited. The Soviets did not recruit a decorative assistant. They gained an operator who could approach sources, carry documents, remember instructions, and remain composed when a routine journey turned dangerous. When Morris entered the U.S. Army during World War II, Lona continued working with contacts involved in technical and industrial espionage. Her greatest strength was not invisibility. It was the ability to make everyone believe there was nothing worth seeing. That talent became critical at Los Alamos. Theodore Hall was only 19 when he joined the Manhattan Project, making him one of its youngest physicists. He worked on the implosion design used for the plutonium bomb. Hall feared a post-war world in which the United States alone possessed nuclear weapons, and he volunteered information to the Soviet Union. He was not working for money. Like the Cohens, he convinced himself that sharing the secret could prevent one nation from using atomic power without restraint. Whatever the motive, the result was espionage against the most secret military program in American history. Hall needed a courier who could cross the distance between New Mexico and New York without connecting him directly to a Soviet official. In late August 1945, Lona traveled to Albuquerque and met him. He passed her a sketch and documents describing the weapon. By then, the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had made Los Alamos the center of an intense security operation. At the station, officers were searching and questioning travelers. Lona concealed Hall's material beneath the tissues, then turned the security check into theater. By asking an officer to hold the very object he should have inspected, she transformed him from investigator into unwitting accomplice. The documents reached her Soviet handlers in New York. The tissue box escape became the perfect legend because it reduced the atomic age to one human reflex. People trust what appears helpless and ordinary. But Hall's information was not the only channel into Moscow. Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, and other sources also supplied atomic intelligence through separate networks. No single courier handed Stalin the Soviet bomb. Together, however, the stolen reports allowed Soviet scientists to compare designs, confirm decisions, avoid some failures, and understand how far the American program had progressed. The Cohens were links in that larger chain, small enough to escape public attention, but positioned where the most dangerous information changed hands. After the war, those networks began to collapse. Defections and intercepted communications exposed connections that Soviet intelligence had spent years constructing. Klaus Fuchs was arrested in Britain in 1950. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were soon pulled into an investigation that would end with their execution. The Cohens had worked near people and channels now vulnerable to discovery. Remaining in New York meant waiting for the next interrogation, the next decoded message, or the next frightened associate to mention their names. A warning arrived. Morris and Lona left the United States in 1950 and did not return. Their disappearance was not the theatrical scene the FBI might have expected. There was no final gunfight, no luggage abandoned beneath a station clock, no public declaration. They crossed out of the country, eventually reached the Soviet bloc, and spent the following years learning how to live as people who had never existed. Their next identities required more than forged papers. They needed invented childhoods, convincing accents, remembered relatives, habits formed in places they had never visited, and answers ready for casual questions from future neighbors. In 1954, Peter and Helen Kroger appeared in Britain using New Zealand passports. They settled at 45 Cranley Drive in Ruislip, west of London, and presented themselves as a respectable Canadian couple. Peter dealt in antiquarian books. Helen managed the home and social life surrounding it. The cover was carefully chosen. A book dealer could correspond internationally, receive parcels, send packages across borders, and explain contact with strangers. The bungalow offered privacy without isolation. It was close enough to London for meetings, ordinary enough to disappear among thousands of similar homes, and unremarkable enough that no neighbor would imagine Moscow listening from beneath its floor. The house became the communications center of the Portland spy ring. The ring's original breach began with Harry Houghton, a former Royal Navy Master-at-Arms who had worked for the British Naval Attaché in Warsaw. Polish intelligence recruited him, and his case later passed to the Soviets. When Houghton returned to Britain in 1953, he found work at the Royal Navy's underwater detection establishment at Portland. A colleague, Ethel G., had access to material of even higher classification. Together, they removed documents, plans, and film connected to anti-submarine research and Britain's emerging nuclear submarine fleet. At weekends, Houghton and G traveled to London while pretending to be an ordinary couple taking in a show. Their contact was Gordon Lonsdale, supposedly a Canadian businessman. His real name was Conan Melody, a KGB officer living under a stolen identity with no diplomatic protection. Houghton and G gave him naval material. Lonsdale paid them and carried the intelligence onward. His visits to Ruislip connected the stolen files to the Krogers, who converted raw espionage into messages Moscow could receive. Inside the bungalow, domestic objects concealed an intelligence station. Investigators would later discover a radio transmitter beneath the kitchen floor and an aerial more than 70 feet long hidden in the loft. The equipment could send rapid bursts toward Moscow at night, reducing the time British monitors had to locate the signal. Other documents were photographed and reduced to microdots, images so small they could be hidden in correspondence or inside books from Peter's business. A battery contained a secret compartment. A container of talcum powder concealed equipment. Objects that belonged in an ordinary home had been redesigned to store money, codes, and messages. The operation was effective because it joined two different kinds of concealment. Houghton and G hid behind government employment and weak security at Portland. The Krogers hid behind identities built years earlier by Soviet intelligence. One side could steal the documents but could not safely transmit them. The other side could communicate with Moscow without entering a naval establishment. Lonsdale joined the two. Each layer protected the next, ensuring that an investigator who discovered one suspicious employee would still have to cross several identities before reaching the communications hub. The exact volume of secrets lost has never been established. MI5 later noted that Lonsdale claimed Houghton supplied hundreds of test pamphlets on anti-submarine equipment, including material related to Britain's nuclear submarine fleet. British naval authorities believed information from Portland helped the Soviet Union develop a quieter generation of submarines. That conclusion cannot measure every design altered in Moscow or every Western tracking advantage reduced. It does reveal why the ring mattered. Nuclear submarines were becoming mobile launch platforms, capable of remaining hidden at sea. Anything that made them quieter changed the calculations of a future nuclear war. The network's destruction began not in Ruislip, but inside Polish intelligence. In 1960, information from Polish defector Michael Goleniewski alerted the West to a Soviet source connected to the British Navy. MI5 identified Houghton and placed him under surveillance. Watchers followed his trips with G and observed their meetings with Lonsdale. Then Lonsdale led surveillance teams to Cranley Drive. The Krogers had spent years making their home look ordinary. They could not prevent another member of the network from repeatedly bringing British intelligence to their door. MI5 initially wanted more time. Watching the ring might reveal additional sources and communication routes. But Goleniewski's imminent defection created a deadline. If Moscow learned that the Polish officer had escaped, it could warn every compromised agent he knew about. The British could either continue watching and risk losing the entire network, or arrest the 5 people already identified. The decision was made before the next scheduled handoff. On Saturday, January 7, 1961, Houghton and Guy traveled to London under surveillance. Near the Old Vic Theatre, they met Lonsdale. Special branch officers moved in and arrested all 3 with secret naval material in their possession. At almost the same moment, detectives arrived at the Kroger bungalow. The arrests were synchronized to prevent one part of the network from warning another. For the first time since leaving America, Morris and Lona were trapped without an exit route prepared in advance. Helen remained controlled as officers entered the house. Before leaving, she picked up her handbag and asked permission to stoke the fire. It sounded like the small request of a homeowner worried about an unattended room. The officer in charge refused and took the bag from her. Inside was microdot communication linking Lonsdale to Moscow. Had Helen reached the fire, the evidence might have vanished in seconds. The woman who once persuaded an American security officer to hold an atomic secret could not persuade a British detective to release her handbag. The search of 45 Cranley Drive continued for more than a week. Beneath the kitchen floor, investigators uncovered the radio transmitter. In the loft, they found its long aerial. Hidden compartments contained spy equipment and thousands of dollars intended for operations. The house held microdot materials, codes, false documents, and passports issued in the names Peter and Helen Kroger. Then Fingerprints produced the final reversal. Scotland Yard records matched prints provided earlier by the FBI. The Canadian booksellers were identified not after their deaths, but during the investigation itself. They were the missing American Soviet agents Morris and Lona Cohen. All 5 members of the ring pleaded not guilty, but the evidence survived every denial. Lonsdale received 25 years in prison. Morris and Lona were each sentenced to 20 years. Houghton and G received 15 years each. The Cohens refused opportunities to expose other Soviet sources, protecting the network that had already consumed their names and their freedom. Their loyalty did not prevent Moscow from waiting 8 years before bringing them home. In 1969, Britain exchanged the Cohens for Gerald Brooke, a British citizen imprisoned in the Soviet Union after distributing anti-Soviet material. Morris and Lona arrived in Moscow not as failed suburban booksellers, but as celebrated intelligence veterans. They received Soviet decorations, and later accounts describe them helping prepare a new generation of clandestine operatives. After the Soviet Union collapsed, both were awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation. Lona died in 1992. Morris followed in 1995. They never returned to the United States, whose secrets had made their careers. The Cohens did not survive through invisibility alone. They survived by controlling what other people believed they were seeing. A confused passenger, a devoted political idealist, a Canadian book dealer, a neighbor tending her fire. Every disguise was built from an ordinary role that society had already learned not to question. So which protected them longer? Their training, their ideology, or the instinctive trust of everyone around them? Tell us in the comments. Subscribe to the Modern Ledger and continue with our next Cold War file, because behind every official history lies another identity waiting to be entered in the ledger.